start recording?
It's recording.
Okay, wonderful. Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the APIC Board of Directors, I'm delighted to welcome everybody to our webinar today. I am Allison Osfed, and I am here with you all in my role as a private citizen and on my own time, and also in my role as a current member of the APIC Board of Directors, serving in the role of chair. And it brings me great pleasure to be with our community today. Before we get started with our program, we wanted to invite everybody to
much more polite and civilized, more like a debate is supposed to be.
Folks could mute their mics. We'd appreciate it very much. Thank you. And also, we wanted to take a moment to just recognize the moment that we're in right now. In particular, APIC as an organization wanted to share our concern about the recent executive orders that prohibit diversity training in federal organizations, and want to share that we are disturbed, as many members of our training community are, by these orders, and that they are not in alignment with our diversity statement and our diversity goals. And we believe that this present issue and other similar issues, while intense and distracting, we feel it's important to be sure that we are not deterred from our overall goal and mission to improve health and well-being and to train future health service psychologists in matters of diversity and social responsivity. And so despite what happens outside of our psychology community, we want to remain firmly committed to diversity, social justice, equity and inclusion, and responsivity, and developing a socially responsive science base in the service of humanity. And we also want to acknowledge that, like myself, Dr. Sanchez is with us as a private citizen, and his views and his knowledge that he shares with us today are his own, and they do not represent any organization with which he may be affiliated. And then finally, we recognize that the community may be wishing for guidance from APIC and other members of the broader training community on the tensions that these executive orders place between following expectations in certain workplaces and also doing what is right and ethical in terms of psychology training. And so we do want the community to be aware that we as a board are actively discussing this matter and that we plan to develop guidance, but we do not have that guidance developed yet at this point. So just wanted to share all of those thoughts with everyone and know that we are worried too, and we are working to be helpful at this time. And with that, again, I want to welcome everyone and thank you for being with us today. And I'd like to thank my colleague, Dr. Mary Mendoza-Newman, who has chaired our membership conference committee. And this particular topic is coming to you today because it was slated for our membership conference in 2020, which of course had to shift because of the pandemic. So I want to welcome and thank Dr. Mendoza-Newman.
Thank you so much, Allison. I'm really delighted to welcome everybody today. As Allison stated, we had to pivot our conference, but are very grateful to Dr. Sanchez for being available to present his plenary to us, and it's certainly very timely. So next slide, please. I wanted to review our Zoom etiquette. Reminder to folks that this is a webinar, so all participants are muted. We do recommend that you use the speaker instead of gallery view so you can focus on the speaker and view the slideshow at the same time. Also, please do use the chat box for questions and comments. We will be moderating the chat and do welcome the questions, and there'll be time for Q&A at the end. But also if there's something pertinent to what's being discussed in the moment and you require some clarification, don't hesitate to let us know. Also, so please unmute yourself if you do choose to speak rather than use the chat. And then a reminder that the webinar is being recorded and it will be shared with APIC programs at the, when it becomes available. We'll certainly post it and email you to let you know. Next slide, please. So a reminder that there are continuing education units available for today. If you registered and received an email, if you registered, you will receive an email to complete the evaluation at the end. And the recording again and slides will be made available on the website, but CEs are only available if you've been present for the live presentation. Thank you, Jeff. Next slide, please. And so these are the APIC board members that will be present today moderating the chat. Our chair, Dr. Allison Osfed, Jeff Baker, the executive director of APIC, myself, Mary Mendoza Newman, and Dr. Shona Vass, also our APIC secretary. Next slide, please. I am so delighted to welcome Orlando. Tell you a little bit about Orlando. He is Nusavi or Mixtecto, indigenous immigrant from southern Mexico. He's bilingual in Spanish and English. He's cross-cultural clinical neuropsychologist and a consultant who holds an appointment in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Washington. He's also adjunct instructor at the University of Valley of Guatemala in Guatemala City. Dr. Sanchez attended Seattle Pacific University and completed his doctoral internship at the University of Miami Jackson Memorial Hospital. He completed postdoctoral fellowships in neuropsychology at Truman VA Medical Center in Minneapolis VA healthcare system. His clinical and research interests include cross-cultural neuropsychology, particularly assessment and treatment pertaining to indigenous peoples of the Americas, cultural competency and cultural competency training, acculturation, and health disparities are all interest of his. So bienvenido, Dr. Sanchez. We are super delighted to learn from you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Can I have some confirmation that you are able to see my slides?
We cannot see your slides right now.
Oh. Let's see here.
And I have them if you need backup.
Let me try this again.
We can view them now, somewhat.
There we go.
Okay. Bueno, gracias.
Ridanya nivi, rindana kakuini, ñaño shiñara ridana komirazon, shiña shinitonio shinanima, nawato shinyo, rubeni. My gratitude to the APIC board for this wonderful opportunity and for the invitation. Thank you in particular to Dr. Mendoza Newman for coordinating with me. I appreciate your support. It's a pleasure to be here. And before I jump into the topic today, if I can just take a few more minutes to share a little bit about who I am. Normally, I share my cultural background to honor my family, my cultural heritage, my community, and in doing so, hopefully make Indigenous communities more visible. But today, I want to share more than just who I am and where I come from. I want to briefly share what drew me to the field of psychology and how I came to be here today, sharing my reflections and insights with you. I was born in the village that you see here in the southern part of Mexico. The picture on the top right is a picture of my village at the height of the rainy season. The bottom right is a picture of my village as the dry season approaches. The top left is a picture of people in my village hard at work building our first paved sidewalk. And this was roughly around the year 2000. My family immigrated to the US in the early 90s, and I did most of my schooling here in the US. However, simultaneously, I was learning about our indigenous philosophy, our way of life, our values, traditions, our perspectives on health and illness. And in many ways, I was being groomed to eventually step into a position of elder in my community, like my father before me, to use indigenous wisdom in service of my family and community. Immediately after graduating from high school, I retreated to my village where I spent several months solidifying my connection to the wisdom of my people. As my village and I together contemplated my next move forward in terms of a formal education in the US, we concluded that it would be in the best interest of my family, my community, to learn how the dominant culture, the US culture, one of the most advanced cultures in the world, approached the study of the human mind, of human behavior, to learn about their science, their tools available to address human suffering. And more importantly, how this knowledge, this wealth of knowledge and technology could help my village. With this in mind, I enrolled at my local community college and have since devoted my professional life to learning and mastering, to the degree that I can, the dominant culture's approach to the study of human behavior, human mind, to truly appreciate and understand their collective wisdom and science, to learn and master their art of assessment and healing practices, and to combine this knowledge with the knowledge and wisdom of my people to serve my family and community. This is how I come to you today. I want to share with you what my journey has yielded thus far with respect to cultural competency training. Before jumping into the topic, I want to briefly acknowledge people who have contributed in significant ways to this presentation. I want to thank my friend and mentor, Dr. Ted Judd, and his wife, Roberta DeBoard. Dr. Judd and I have walked this journey together for the past 10 years, and much of what you will hear today, I learned directly from him or was inspired by his teachings. I also want to thank the entire Minneapolis VA psychology training program. There are over 80 psychologists, and it isn't feasible for me to name all, but I'm incredibly grateful to this training institution who remains firmly committed to issues of social justice and cultural competency. Their tenacity, sensitivity, passion to advance our field on this front greatly inspired me. If Dr. Judd provided or inspired the content of this presentation, the Minneapolis VA training program inspired and contributed to the vision, the framework, with their enthusiasm, support, resources, and just all around partnership. We generated and implemented a model that offers a viable path forward, in my opinion. I especially want to thank Dr. Wayne Siegel. As an aspiring training director, his guidance, mentorship, and support have been invaluable to me. I also especially want to thank the entire Minneapolis VA neuropsychology training program, whom I regard as my professional family. I want to thank my mentor and dear friend, Dr. Greg Lamberty, and his wife, Lori Lamberty. Lori took the time to tune in on her birthday, no less. So I want to wish her a happy birthday y un abrazo muy fuerte para usted. I just want to quickly highlight what has already been expressed. I have nothing to disclose, and the opinions and views that I expressed today are my own, and I don't officially represent any organization or institution. All right. So our agenda for today, I want to share the history of cultural competence with you, and we'll hopefully make a good case as to why it is vital that we incorporate this history into training curriculum. I will discuss why our current approach to cultural competency is outdated, out of sync with the accomplishments and advancements that we have made over the last 4 decades. I will share a new model that takes this history, our history, into consideration, our accomplishments, our advancements, a model that is supported by available empirical literature. While this model doesn't address all issues, it offers at least a partial solution and guidance for a path forward. My goal is to articulate this information in a concise, succinct, and clear manner so that you can walk away with something tangible. So please, if I share something that isn't entirely clear, please feel free to interrupt so that I can address the question in real time. If you have any broader general questions, please, if you don't mind waiting until the end of the presentation, I'm happy to address those at that time. So let's jump in. So concerns about the need to develop clinical multicultural skills emerged as early as the 1960s and 70s. And this is where the construct of cultural encapsulation was born. As many of you know, cultural encapsulation is basically the fish in water phenomenon. In other words, it's our inability to perceive ourselves and others as cultural beings, which, among other things, impacts our assessment and healing practices. The actual concept of cultural competency was not formally introduced until the early 1980s. Cultural competence as a more coherent conceptualization appeared concurrently within the fields of social work and counseling psychology. And of course, this movement, the cultural competency movement in psychology, was powered by the civil rights movement. Over the next 4 decades, this body of literature, cultural competence, expanded significantly across disciplines and settings, from medicine to the social sciences to business and education and so on. Collectively, this body of literature fomented by the civil rights movement was successful in generating widespread support in the form of increased scrutiny and pressure regarding how individuals, institutions, and organizations and how they address healthcare inequities via formal training, policies, regulations, rules, so on. As early as the 80s, following the social direction initiated by the civil rights movement, federal mandates and in turn, local governments made the inclusion of cultural competence objectives a funding requirement for service programs. From coast to coast, from Seattle to New York, laws have been enacted requiring public agencies to comply with cultural competence standards. Overall, with respect to psychology in particular, if we were to broadly summarize the major accomplishments of the cultural competence movement that emerged in the in the 60s and 70s, we could reasonably argue that one, cultural competence is now a valued perspective, and two, we now have established mechanisms, policies, standards in place demanding inclusivity, change, and more favorable outcomes in terms of meeting the clinical needs of humanity. In fact, as recently as 2017, there was added pressure by the American Psychological Association's Commission on Accreditation, requiring that accredited programs or those seeking accreditation detail tangible plans for how their trainees will acquire cultural competence. They go beyond just how trainees will acquire competence, and they ask that they have tangible plans in terms of how they plan to recruit diverse applicants and retain and recruit diverse faculty. So what has this meant for psychology and training in the 21st century? Well, training programs, particularly internship training programs across the country now find themselves in a bit of a bind, in a bit of a crisis. On one hand, they have mounting pressure from relevant organizations, accrediting bodies, who want to see the full integration of diverse perspectives into the training and clinical practice enterprise. These organizations want to close the gap on health disparities. Bottom line, they want all human beings to get high quality care regardless of who they are or where they come from. And ultimately, who is responsible for integrating and accomplishing this? The training program. More specifically, internship training directors and their training faculty and staff. The problem is that practical guidance is lacking. No one really knows what this looks like or how to implement this in a practical manner. Accrediting bodies demand change, but don't offer much prescriptive guidance. Likewise, the literature in this regard is largely silent. Though the cultural competency literature is vast, and it truly is quite gigantic. If you've never taken a look, it's quite overwhelming. But only vast in width, not a whole lot of depth. What I mean by that is, for example, we don't have consensus on an operational definition. We don't have a unified model, framework, or approach for how one develops cultural competency. We don't have adequate training curriculum. We don't have standards or metrics to vet who is culturally competent. In addition, training programs are merely one sliver within their respective organizations or institutions. So lots of barriers overall. On the other hand, you have incoming trainees who have benefited from the cultural competency movement. Thanks to the aforementioned organizational efforts and pressure by our accrediting bodies, the number of ethnic minority trainees has steadily increased over the last 2 decades. We now have more ethnic minority trainees in the field than ever before. And in terms of cultural competency, often both ethnic and dominant culture trainees are coming into internship training programs much more knowledgeable and prepared than faculty, the current faculty are. And it is almost universal across training programs across the country that trainees are voicing dissatisfaction with diversity training. And often faculty, understandably, are scratching their heads trying to figure out, why are trainees dissatisfied? What do they want? And what can we as faculty, as a training program, what can we do differently? In my humble opinion, in some respects, trainees want what accrediting bodies want, which is full integration of diverse perspectives. Said differently, trainees are already coming in with some knowledge under their belts. The expectation is that internship and fellowship will provide them with something else, something more clinically relevant, practical skills. Bottom line, I believe trainees are ready to answer the call to offer high quality care to all humans, regardless of who they are or where they come from. However, on internship, they often get more of the same they got in grad school, or sometimes perhaps something less, depending on the program. So many want practical clinical skills to address the clinical needs of historically marginalized communities. In the end, training directors and faculty feel pressure from both sides with very little guidance or resources. So what has been done? How have training programs responded to the cultural competency movement that began in the 60s? Well, like other organizations, training programs began by publicly acknowledging that they valued and welcomed diversity. In psychology, this quickly became insufficient, though many organizations to date still linger here without active intent to scrutinize their respective structures and make reasonable adjustments. In psychology, APA graduate programs were the first on the hot seat, and as a result, the first to spearhead this process. How did APA graduate programs respond? Well, bolstered by the organizational pressure, diversity committees were born. Often it wasn't formal committees as much as a group of individuals that, among other things, fought to carve out space in an already crowded graduate school curriculum. In the end, the theme of racial inequality was imported into the training curriculum with an emphasis on race and ethnicity, largely ignoring other important elements of diversity, such as disability. And so a siloed approach was born, or what I refer to as the parade of cultures. In this didactic and training approach, trainees are bombarded with facts about different ethnic groups. For example, today we'll talk about African American, next Latinos, next Asian American, next Native American, and so on. And this gave rise to the idea that one needed to be pretty much an anthropologist or an expert in every culture, which is incorrect and impossible. No way, no one can become an expert in every culture. And even if you could, you don't need to be an expert in every culture to deliver competent clinical cross-cultural services. This proved to be the monumental failure of this approach, that it didn't translate into clinical practice. But in some respects, I don't know that that was the intention of this approach. I think that at that time, perhaps the intention was to make the invisible visible. And that was successful, because we had this increase in awareness, which is the awareness that now incoming trainees are bringing into the internship environment. It is my intuition that what came next in terms of a training approach was a direct result of at least two factors. I think one of the factors was the failure of the parade of cultures approach to meet clinical needs. And the other, it's the socioeconomic political factors outside of psychology, outside of the training environment. For example, police brutality, from Trayvon Martin to George Floyd. These factors paved way for what came next. These forces gave rise to the awareness and sensitivity training movement in psychology, with topics such as microaggression, privilege, and power, which are dominating the conversation today. And this is the current awareness sensitivity approach suggests that our field's inability to offer high quality care to humans, regardless of who they are or where they come from, is due to factors such as microaggressions, bias, and white privilege. The narrative appears to suggest that these factors stand in the way of progress in cultural competency training in psychology. I submit that this is not in line with what our field has produced, with our field's track record since the civil rights movement. It simply is not in line with the success and accomplishments over the last 4 decades. Does racism exist? Absolutely. I find it to be an unfortunate side effect of our existence. And as such, I find that it will forever require the watchful eye of conscientious, decent citizens to manage it. I personally have had plenty of personal experience with overt racism and discrimination and a myriad of microaggressions along my journey here. While these have been poignant and life-changing at times, this is not the primary force that is holding us back in psychology. This is not what's preventing progress in cultural competency training in psychology. And I don't offer my personal experience as evidence, but my experience appears to mirror the history of our field, at least since the cultural competency movement began. With respect to training models, while no doubt there has been improvement each time, like technology, and going from the phone book and landline to the flip phone, we need to catch up with technology. and get to the iPhone of training. Currently, the traditional models that we have continuously fail in that there is a clear disconnect between our approach to diversity, cultural competence, and the fundamental essence of a psychology training institution. In other words, we fail at our responsibility to expand a trainee's knowledge base, to help acquire new skills, to sharpen existing ones. So none of the aforementioned models directly tied to clinical practice. After a trainee or staff undergo a typical traditional diversity didactic, they will return to work and find themselves equally frustrated, perhaps anxious and fearful of offending someone, or being perceived as a racist, or simply just unprepared to work with individuals from the diverse backgrounds. This is my contribution to the topic. I want to close the gap between training and clinical practice. So briefly, I want to review the empirical and theoretical underpinnings of a model, which I have dubbed the Sanchez Judd Minneapolis VA model in honor of the contributions from Dr. Judd and the Minneapolis VA training program. In the next slide, I will quickly note the essential components of this model, and I will offer a detailed rationale for why this should be included and at what stage of training. Overall, you'll note that this model offers only partial solutions and several recommendations that are beyond any single individual's or institution's control and require mass collaboration from the larger training community. Although internship training programs are currently in the hot seat, we need collective action to move forward. So briefly, the model acts as a coherent, empirically informed framework, a way to hold in all of this information, and it facilitates learning because it focuses our attention on key constructs in an organized manner to begin to make those that move forward into approaching clinical skill. At its core, it relies on the work of Sue and colleagues, as well as the work of Gallegos. As you will note, I retain all the components from Sue's tripartite model, but it reinterpret them to facilitate that leap into clinical practice. I retain the constructs of cultural awareness and cultural sensitivity. But again, I give them a slight upgrade or a shift in focus. In that new focus, I rely heavily on the work of Ren and his construct of cultural encapsulation, as well as the work of Tervalon and Murray Garcia's construct of cultural humility. This has proven quite useful as it allows one to conceptualize awareness and sensitivity as both existing on a spectrum or a continuum, as well as a developmental process. As I mentioned before, the literature on cultural competency is vast and wide, but not a lot of depth. So to close that gap and get closer to practical application, the model borrows heavily from adjacent literatures, particularly identity development and several identity development models. These aren't perfect, but they are quite useful. It also borrows from acculturation models and the literature on the therapeutic relationship. These are the essential components. Now, let me briefly share how to implement these. And here I ask you to suspend reality for a minute and fantasize with me. I will describe in ideal terms how these should be implemented for optimal results. Let me begin with cultural knowledge, or just knowledge. I would argue that what you see here is foundational knowledge, and that ideally it should be taught in graduate schools. This is the kind of curriculum I envision at a graduate level. I believe these elements are essential elements. For example, context is important. The history of cultural competency is fundamental for understanding where we come from, where we are now, and where we need to go. We need to be aware of our accomplishments and recognize the gaps in order to improve and innovate. We need to understand the difference between culture and diversity and appreciate all human complexity, not just racial and ethnic background. I would argue that any curriculum start by first having a firm grasp of this history, the history of cultural competency, and how this has influenced training in psychology. There is considerable controversy as to whether cultural competency is a theory or a value or a perspective or something else. I consider it to be an extension of the therapeutic relationship. As many of you know, the therapeutic relationship or working alliance has been construed as involving two interrelated components: the client's positive emotional connection to the therapist, and that shared understanding of the task. In other words, can the therapist appreciate the other's worldview and calibrate to ensure the client feels or knows they share a mutual goal? In other words, is the task our task? Is the goal our goal? Is the approach our approach? I believe that the therapeutic relationship within the context of cultural competency is a fundamental component of training. It is crucial that any cultural competency curriculum include the classic works, particularly the work of Sue and colleagues. Much of the accomplishments and success thus far can be traced back to Sue's tripartite model. With respect to cultural awareness and sensitivity, as I mentioned earlier, these can be conceptualized as existing on a spectrum or a continuum. Let me give you an example. So what we have is that at one end of the spectrum, we have the parochial stage, or the stage of cultural encapsulation. This is what I call the fish and water phenomenon. Quick story to expand on the fish and water phenomenon, a story by David Foster Wallace. There's three fish. An older wise fish swimming in the direction of two younger fish. As they cross paths, the older wise fish looks to the younger fish and says, morning, nods and says, morning, boys, how's the water? The two young fish swim for a bit before eventually one turns to the other and says, what the hell is water? Clinicians with no awareness are clinicians practicing under the blind assumption that their unique worldview is universal. I believe that this, in large part, is generational, at least here in the US. The cultural competency movement has made it virtually impossible for a new clinician, at least an incoming clinician, not to be aware of cultural differences. And I think in some part, maybe this is what's happening in some training programs where incoming trainees, there's this cultural, let's call it a cultural gap, where incoming trainees are working with faculty and staff. The further back their training, the greater that gap in terms of practicing under cultural encapsulation. And I don't think, I would say that it's benign, or I'd like to believe that it's benign neglect as a function of their generation and the training they had. I don't believe it to be a conscious issue of overt racism and discrimination. Next is the ethnocentric stage. This is the individual that has awareness but no sensitivity. This is the clinician that is aware that others may have different perspectives on health and illness, but judges that perspective to be less than, or perhaps primitive, or just that perspective has little value. And so they go with treatment as usual. They proceed with status quo. Next is the ambivalent stage. And these are clinicians that both recognize the value, they recognize and value the other's worldview, but don't have the tools to offer something other than status quo. And I believe this is where most of us are in right now. Certainly most incoming trainees. Then we have the synergistic stages where we begin to acquire the tools, the skills to offer something more than status quo. And finally, the participatory third stage, or cultural humility. This is where clinicians feel relatively comfortable offering treatment that is more culturally competent. Awareness and sensitivity can be conceptualized as a spectrum or continuum, but it can also be conceptualized as a developmental process. We can track a person's attitude as well as skill. For example, at the ethnocentric stage, what you're primarily working with is attitude. You need to overcome this attitude or so it requires a change in attitude before you can get to skill. And you need both a functional attitude and the right skill to progress along the spectrum towards cultural humility. Training programs can explore and track and promote this. How? So you might be wondering how. How do programs explore, track, and promote this? Promote a functional, culturally competent attitude and skill repertoire. Well, first we need to understand it and recognize it and then use it and promote it. So we need foundational working knowledge. We need an environment that seizes and capitalizes on that knowledge and that adjusts their structures to put that knowledge to use. So the first thing we need is that working knowledge, which is what I promote here. Next, we foster the functional attitude. We enter that mental space needed to convert our knowledge into skill. And for that, we need identity development and identity development models. These allow us to do a deep dive into who we are as cultural beings. This is the process of awakening to the realization that we are fish in water. We need to recognize ourselves first before we can begin to recognize others. And it is important that we do this from a non-judgmental place. So to become the Darwin of your existence. I mean, really, what we're getting at is a pretty deeply philosophical process, and this is why when you ask your patient to tell you about who they are, it quickly goes downhill because it's hard to answer or to speak to who you are. What makes up who you are? Why do you have this perspective, about depression or about your style of communication? So identity development can hugely augment, can help in this process, and experiential learning can also be very useful when paired with this knowledge. Cultural immersion in particular, if you approach it from the right mental space, it's an incredible learning opportunity. And I will have more specific examples on the type of reflection exercises that you can use in a few slides down the road. And this process it can be further augmented by our understanding of acculturation and how humans adapt or adjust to the change in their environment. Ideally, I would argue that this fundamental knowledge, what you see here on screen, needs to be taught in graduate school. I believe this is possible now. Graduate programs across the country have successfully carved out space to teach cultural competency and cultural competency related topics. In my opinion, what they are currently teaching is inefficient. And I would invite all stakeholders in graduate programs to review this work, to scrutinize what I have shared today. And if you reach the same conclusion, that you consider modifying your curriculum. If we were to accomplish this, then trainees would step into internship environments with working knowledge and much more prepared to learn cultural competency clinical skills. So then, continuing with the ideal scenario, so if that were to happen at the graduate level, then what do we do in internship? Well, in internship, we would pick up where graduate school left off. If graduate programs taught my proposed curriculum, what training at the internship level would then look like this. Training programs could build on, for example, the therapeutic relationship. And so rather than just share, let me see if I can give you a quick demonstration. So for example, working on the therapeutic relationship, you would want to teach trainees the relevant cultural information that is going to help in that endeavor. So how to do a cultural background that facilitates that. So you could teach, for example, trainees how to use cultural profiles. I don't know if can you see this web page?
Yes.
Okay, so let's say you are scheduled to meet with a Hmong patient. Well, the therapeutic relationship would say that you need to consume relevant cultural information that's going to facilitate that encounter. So what do you do? Well, and training programs could teach this. Okay, where can you readily access reliable information? And Ethnomed is a partnership between, here in Washington, it's a partnership between a local hospital and the University of Washington. And similar websites are popping up in different areas of the country, where this one in particular, Ethnomed, it's aimed at physicians, so our colleagues, but it can be useful for us. And so teaching a trainee that, okay, you're meeting with a Hmong a patient, well, it would be a good idea for you to, for example, learn learn about greetings. What can you incorporate as you greet this Hmong patient? What are some etiquettes that you maybe should be mindful of as you engage in your encounter? What are the family relationships? For example, I can't go into in detail, but if you peruse on your own time, you'll see that there's information. For example, there's acculturation processes. So if it's a traditional family, you ought to show respect, maybe speak to the head of the household. I wanted to see if there's a bunch of just rich information that you can draw from, and I could spend hours here, but I want to move on. I just want to give you a flavor of now at the internship, this is the kind of skill that we would be looking at. And here, for example, this is where acculturation comes into play. Well, we can't make the assumption that our patient is Hmong and they adhere to their traditional background. Maybe we ought to look into acculturation. Were they born here? Are they second generation or third generation? Do they espouse an assimilation approach? Do they espouse a separated approach? All of that information is important and begins to inform the clinical encounter. So this is the kind of information you could teach. You could teach your trainee how to effectively use the DSM-5 cultural formulation once they have gathered that information. And the DSM-5 relies heavily on identity development and acculturation. It's not perfect, but it's a highly useful tool that few programs are using. You could and here, without getting too bogged down, again, I'm struggling with how much I'm acutely aware that there's a lack of practical guidance, and I have this pull to want to offer as much practical guidance as I can, but I can quickly go on a tangent. So let me just move on here then. This kind of knowledge can be enhanced, and of course, the clinical encounters offer the prime opportunity to expand and put this knowledge into play. And this can be augmented by experiential exercises. And here I've put some experiential exercises, and it's important that you know that those experiential exercises really aim at at boosting that attitude, at fostering that right attitude, that right perspective. Again, like I said, just to bring the message home before I move on, ideally at the internship level, we would aim to remain true to the essence of what that means. The internship year is a period of professional learning experience in order to acquire relevant skills and practical experience. And ideally, we would provide the skill of facilitating an effective therapeutic relationship, the skill of effective cross-cultural communication, the skill of effectively executing a clinical interview and assessment, the skill of generating cultural formulation, and ultimately provide culturally responsive treatment and generate appropriate treatment recommendations. Now, thus far, I've been naively idealistic in how I envision the implementation of this model. And I'm acutely aware that I have not offered internship programs much direct prescriptive guidance thus far, particularly on how to help trainees develop the skills that I suggest here. And as I've shared at the beginning of my presentation, this model doesn't address all issues. It offers only partial solutions and a guidance for a path forward. Here is why I can only offer partial solutions. This is our current reality, as I mentioned before. APA internship, what we have, APA internship training programs are currently in the hot seat. with mounting pressure from our professional organizations, accrediting bodies on one side, and trainees on the other side. In addition, the literature on cultural competency is still in its infancy and has yet to produce answers and guidance and solutions. In addition, you as training programs exist within a larger institution or system with maybe different goals or competing demands. There are many factors here alone that pose a great challenge. Are programs APA accredited or not, rural or urban, for-profit or nonprofit, big or small, and so on. So lots of differences and variables here. A major factor is the fact that many of you were hired to do a job, not necessarily train. So therefore you must worry about productivity, those pesky RVUs. Not to mention that the internship is only 1 year. And like graduate programs in the 90s, it's getting crowded. That internship year is getting crowded. Assessment, research, psychotherapy, training demands, everything is important. Our field is becoming increasingly specialized with more demands in focused areas such as rehab and neuropsych, PTSD, borderline eating disorder, substance abuse, so on, etc. Let's take neuropsychology alone, for example. Where does this training track begin? Does it begin in graduate school, internship? The powers that be haven't quite figured this one out yet. It can't be graduate school because internship is a generalist year and applicants must be prepared for such a generalist year. At the same time, in internship, neuropsych trainees must rack up as much experience in neuro to be competitive for postdoc. So a challenge will be to carve out time and space to truly address the issues of cultural competency training. Last, we have graduate programs and diversity committees that, though well-intended, for sure, currently focus on the narratives that don't address the present issues. And in fact, in some cases, might be contributing to the problem. In a nutshell, our current approach to cultural competency is outdated, out of sync with our history, with the accomplishments and advancements that we have made over the last 4 decades. It appears out of focus, distracted by forces outside of training. It is out of sync with the actual problems and barriers we face. This is our current crisis. And I believe no single institution or individual has all the resources to resolve this crisis. We need collective action. Given our current platform and time, this is as prescriptive as I can be. I invite internship programs to scrutinize what I've shared today. And if you find worth in what I have shared, I invite you to consider implementing this model to the degree that you can, given your resources. This model is flexible, and you can begin by incorporating the right kind of working knowledge, the history of cultural competence, classic works by Sue and colleagues, cultural humility, cultural encapsulation, acculturation models, identity models. You could do this as a formal curriculum or pick a topic and a relevant article and learn alongside your trainee. Use individual supervision, use group supervision, whatever space you have available to consume this working, this knowledge, and to have it, to understand to do a deeper dive. Once you have some comfort with this knowledge, incorporate awareness and sensitivity skills training. Here are some examples. Approach these exercises from the perspective of exploring yourself as a cultural being from a non-judgmental place. The goal here is to recognize the water in which we swim in, so that we can help others recognize, we can readily recognize ourselves and the other's worldview and be able to be a bridge and develop an approach that is our approach, that we can then bring in our patients and help them see that this is our task. We are working together. These first two boxes here, these first two recommendations are, I believe, are relatively manageable for any program. The next, this box may require a bit more ingenuity to bridge the gap from knowledge to clinical skill. You will need consultants and supervisors. Bottom line, you will need someone to guide the work. Finding supervisors and consultants, I admit, will not be easy, but I believe it can be accomplished. And should we as a field accept my proposition, in time, we will have more resources to work with. I encourage you to look within your program or institution. Look to your neighboring institutions, your local community. Identify individuals who have experience working with individuals from diverse backgrounds and develop partnerships with them. If needed, educate them on your training efforts and invite them to participate as consultants and supervisors. Bottom line, you will need assistance from those who are already doing this kind of work. I think it requires courage, for none of us really know what we're doing and whether what we're doing is truly culturally competent. And we have to have an open mind. We have to be open to exposing what we know, open to learning. We need folks who are doing this kind of work to step forward and offer their insights and experience. Hopefully, they have acquired cultural humility and are willing to accept the possibility that they may not be doing things entirely right, but are open to learning together as a community. I would encourage you as a training program to develop a list of consultants, people who are willing to offer cultural consultation to staff and trainees. I also encourage you to develop a list of supervisors, people who are not only willing to offer consultation, but can more directly supervise trainees and their cases. Depending on your resources, you could play around with your supervision models. For example, supervision of supervision. Many of you already are doing this with your trainees, where a postdoc is supervising an intern and then a faculty, the postdoc. So you could do the same thing here. A faculty who is learning cultural competency, clinical work, can be paired with a more skilled supervisor to learn how to do the work and how to supervise a trainee. I encourage training programs to support mentoring efforts. If your institution does not have something formal, I encourage you to develop a diversity mentoring program to serve as another avenue where you can implement what I have shared here. If you can connect to the larger mentoring community at the organizational level. And here, I don't mean simply connect your students and then let them go. Do both. Do your own mentoring program locally and then connect with a larger institution. As I mentioned before, no single institution or individual has all the resources. To resolve this, we need collective action. Internship programs need our support. They need organizational support. I personally am grateful for the pressure coming from our professional organizations and accrediting bodies. They have contributed immensely to the cause. The pressure is great. I wonder if they could do a bit more. You know, something occurred recently in neuropsychology that has me wondering if The same could happen with diversity cultural competency training. And here's what happened recently in the wake of COVID-19. All the major organizations in neuropsychology rallied together to present a unified front to the crisis. I don't have data, I speak anecdotally, but I believe this reverberated positively down to the front lines. As a neuropsychologist, this was incredibly helpful to me to have a single source where I could get all my guidance and information. It was incredibly useful. This is a good model, I think, to emulate. I invite those in strategic positions within our professional organizations who have been working on this for a long time. And these are divided efforts to unify, to come together. If you're those in strategic positions, consider what I've shared today and partner with each other for a unified approach to this crisis, to this training crisis. I invite you to scrutinize the curriculum I suggested, and if needed, modify it. And I encourage our training programs across the country to adopt it. And to the degree that our organizations can take that and promote that, I think that would be incredibly useful. To our organizations, I say, I encourage you to consider generating a national consultation service. Programs vary and resources that they may have available. A rural program may not have the resources and the luxury of cultural consultants or supervisors. And so generating a national consultation service could be incredibly useful and helpful. And not only for consultation, but for supervision. And a national cultural consultation service and mechanism for cultural supervision would be incredibly helpful and useful to internship programs across the country. Reimbursement is something I know some individuals are already looking into. Doing cross-cultural work, particularly given the current training crisis we face, takes time. It's more work for everyone, especially to do it right. Many systems need to be mindful of this and adjust accordingly. Faculty load, training load. These are complex issues that require a unified approach from the entire field of psychology. I would encourage diversity committees, particularly those who have a firm place within their respective organizations and institutions, to examine what I've shared today and divert your efforts to the degree that you can to the recommendations and issues I have outlined here: the curriculum, consultation services, supervision services, mentoring, collaborative partnership with institutions and organizations for a united front to the present crisis. Last, I would encourage trainees to take cultural competency training into your own hands. I would encourage you to understand our history, the history of cultural competency, to incorporate that foundation knowledge that I have outlined here, to seek mentorship, to incorporate self-reflection, to learn how to perceive yourself and others as cultural beings. I would encourage you to calibrate your expectations, recalibrate your expectations. The field cannot give you what it does not have, or it doesn't have yet. I would encourage you not to get distracted by forces outside of our control. To the degree that you can, contribute to solutions, help us move the field forward on this front. We need new perspectives. We need to innovate. We need new energy and passion to move our agenda forward on all levels of training, cultural competency and research, policy, and so on. As I reflect on why I stepped into this field, when I reflect on the question that brought me here, how can psychology serve my Indigenous community? I can tell you that my community and I wisely chose the right career. I have benefited greatly from what you have produced as a professional and scientific community. I can tell you that your science and technology have the capacity to serve my indigenous community and other communities around the world very well. I thank you for your attention and for considering what I have shared today. And with that, I am happy to take your questions.
Okay, looks like we have our first question in the chat. And the question is expressing gratitude for your thoughtful approach and agree that there's limited attention to skills-based cultural competency training, agree about the parade of cultures being problematic, but also wondering about the statement that these trainings have failed and the evidence for that statement. So the concern being expressed is that there's limited assessment and evaluation of the training, both past and present approaches. And so, what's the evidence to draw this conclusion? And then what is the evidence that we might infer that this model would be a stronger model?
That's a great question.
I know, a lot there.
Yeah, that is a great question. And partly I would say is that what I base that conclusion on what the literature has produced. And so that's the unknown, right? What works, what doesn't, when I look at training programs and when I look at, and this is all anecdotal, which is why I invite the larger community to look in that direction in terms of shifting our attention from a value to the skill, right? And so that's where I'm coming from. And so when I look at, gosh, I'm trying to wrap my mind around the question, and where we depart from is a great question in terms of, well, what's the evidence, right? And I guess that's where I'm having a hard time answering, because the evidence, well, there is no evidence there in either direction. There is no model, there is no framework, there is who is culturally competent. How can you all trust that what I'm saying has any depth or weight based on what? And so these are the questions. But I guess I would answer that question in this way. Rather than getting distracted by the value, let's focus our attention on the skill and building those skills. And at this point, I think anything would work. I'm not saying that I have the right answer. I'm saying if what I put here today is not of use, let's scratch it and move in that direction.
I will add, Orlando, that there is some research that suggests not only are trainees dissatisfied with some of the training, but they also feel like they're not getting the skills that they require to work with a diverse communities and populations. There is literature in that. I could certainly look some of those articles up and share them, but there is some evidence from trainees' perspective that we're not doing a good enough job with cross-cultural training.
And I would echo that as well. That is out in the literature in terms of the dissatisfaction. So yes, there is emerging literature there that is capturing that, and I would imagine there's more of it. We're just not looking. But I would hypothesize that if folks did what do they call it? My English and my Spanish is interrupted. A needs assessment. If every institution did a needs assessment, I would be incredibly curious as to what that would, what I would imagine that you would see that faculty feel, well, they feel frustrated. We don't know what to do. Trainees are not happy. They want more. What can we do?
Next question, Dr. Sanchez, is focused on what recommendations you might have for postdoctoral training programs. Because you mentioned graduate training and internships, and people are curious about the implications for more specialized training.
Yeah, that's another great question. For postdoc, I would, and I guess I would say the same thing with not only with postdoc but with faculty, is that again, and I think it's looking at to the training in particular, to learn about the history of our training, and to begin to consume that knowledge, that information. So we that background to then and the same thing would apply is if you don't have a mentor, look to our organization. So depending on what your specialty is, so if it's neuropsych, I would encourage you to connect with the Hispanic the Hispanic Neuropsychological Society, the Asian Neuropsychological Society. So we need mentoring.
I just want to make sure you're finished with paper. What? Are you finished?
Yeah. Sorry.
Good. Okay,
Melissa,
I'm
can
out
you
of
mute your
here.
mic?
I just wanted to make sure you weren't like stuck online with somebody. Okay, perfect. Have a good weekend. I'm not going this Sunday. My husband.
Melissa,
Have Mike
AB,
muted.
on this
can you mute your
weekend,
mic?
And I'm like,
Melissa
I'm not sure how
AB,
I'm
could
gonna
you
be.
kindly mute your mic?
I was like, of all weekends, Katie, why'd you put that one? It's okay, thanks. Yep. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to slam that on you.
Melissa, can
Thank
you please mute your mic?
Oh, and now I have the door stuck. Okay. This is my usual little comedy.
I
video.
can't even see.
It's just how it
her.
goes.
Jeff, are you able to mute?
I'm working on it. How's that?
Thank you.
Orlando, you're muted.
There we go.
Sorry about that, folks.
Okay. Dr. Sanchez, our apologies. It took a while to figure out who that was. I know there was almost 300 people on the call, so it's hard to find everyone when I was had those who were not visual, not here. So you were responding to the question about how to address this training in a postdoc program.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, I think I would say I think the what I have outlined today could also be useful. I guess the question I would have is who the postdoc is, right? So there's the general recommendation would be, I would encourage you to look at the history of cultural competency, to get that foundational knowledge, to connect with a mentor and an organization, and to continue to work, consult, connect with colleagues that can help sharpen your skills.
Our next question is wondering about the activities and the skills that the Minneapolis VA implemented as they used your model for curricular development, and if you can talk a little bit about what they actually did.
Yeah, so there's lots of activities out there. One that I really enjoy is it's an activity put forth by Dr. Sandine and colleagues down in New Mexico. It's the consortium, and it's called Hotspots, Blind Spots, Soft Spots, and really what this is helping trainees um, uh, it's helping trainees begin to analyze themselves as cultural beings. And so it's really getting at that intersectionality, right? In terms of all these components that, so I'm indigenous, but at the same time, I could call myself Mexican because I was born in Mexico. At the same time that I am highly educated, and how power influences that. So I can have power in certain contexts because of my level of education. I could have power, for example, in my village because just of mere fact that I'm a male, and my culture tends to be patriarchal. So by that alone, and so really understanding how the intersectionality of that is working and how power is shifting, and the point there is to begin to see how these factors are influencing you and impacting your worldview, and to recognize that within yourself, and then consider that if you're meeting to be mindful of those factors when you're working with somebody else.
We have a few questions back. This is the question. I'm wondering how trainees who immigrate from other cultures could collaborate with their supervisors in contributing to cultural competence, but also wondering how programs can be open to cultural knowledge that a trainee is able to bring. Do you have any tips on how to have these types of conversations?
Yes, and I think that partnership is incredible, and maybe here is where I could speak a little bit anecdotally in terms of my own personal experience. So I come, and I believe this is true of folks of diverse backgrounds, is they come with knowledge from within their own communities, from their own experience, but how to work with that knowledge. What we wouldn't want is to put, and we've done that in the past, is we sometimes put our trainees to speak. In some sense, we may use them as props to teach others, ignoring that trainee's educational needs, or we inadvertently we might ask them to step in as experts about their own culture. And so first, what we need to do is we need to encourage these trainees to not only have the lived experience of where they come from, but to also have academic knowledge about where they come from, and so to boost their competency, and then working together in a collaborative learning community to learn from each other. There's a lot of that encounter can mirror the therapeutic encounter where, for example, sometimes a trainee, so these are the things that often would get me in trouble, is that, for example, in the American culture, you learn to speak very direct, right? It's a direct approach. Where I come from, we speak in story-like fashions, and that used to get me in trouble. And the system would make characterological assumptions about what that meant. He's not assertive, he's shy. And so making sure that we are curious and take a hypothesis approach to it. Is this a cultural component? how can we bring that in? Can we have an open discussion? And that's where I feel like conversations such as microaggressions, bias, don't help because we are anxious about approaching these kinds of conversations. Yeah, I feel like maybe I'm rambling on. Maybe I should stop. I don't know if I answered the question. I guess I'll just say this. I think it's important that the knowledge of a trainee be incorporated, but from a thoughtful, a thoughtful approach. I think that is very fruitful. I benefited greatly from Dr. Judd's approach to that style of mentoring. He allowed me to become bicultural, not only bicultural in the sense of where I came from in the US, but even in the subculture of academia. The subculture of academia is an entirely different element, and learning, it was key for me to learn how to navigate that environment. And so to the degree that supervisors and mentors and can help, that I have benefited greatly from that approach.
Dr. Sanchez, is the hotspot, blind spot, soft spot resource available like in a link? Is that something accessible online?
That is, yes, I believe that is that was published in an article by, I know it was Dr. Sandine, but I can't, Dr. Rex Swanda, I believe, was also a contributing author. I'm happy to, you could more than likely connect with them. I bet they would be more than happy to share, but I can also, oh yes, Dr. Evelyn Sandine from the University.
Of Maine, okay. Excellent, thank you.
Sandine won the APIC Diversity Award a few years ago for her innovative curriculum.
Okay, well, oh, someone just posted the article on the chat. Excellent, thank you. Thank you, Karen. One final question, how can we be more deliberate in training programs in establishing formal mentors? Often those of us who went through our programs had to find informal mentors.
And that's a great question. And I think that's why I'm asking institutions to consider developing formal mentorship programs at your institution, and at the so organizations, if you all could come together and create mentorship programs, institutions, if you could do that, and then if you could help connect. It is, I mean, it was difficult. Well, I was fortunate to connect with Dr. Judd early on, but I have a lot of colleagues, and that seems to be this is anecdotal. So that's the general sentiment, is that trainees are having a challenging time connecting with mentors, and why there's that need. I'm sorry I don't have any specific guidance on who to connect you with, but there's lots of organizations. There's and most of the ones I know are in neuropsychology, and that's the water I swim in. But I guess if there are any trainees out there, please feel free to connect with me. I'm happy to do what I can to connect you to the right, or to whatever network I have available, or a resource that I might know of. That's probably the best I could do.
You know, I'll just add that as a first gen and woman of color myself, I always share with the trainees my professional journey and the need to network all along the way. It's not something I knew how to do it, but I learned to do it. And so I do support them in figuring out how to get connected through organizations or other folks through the university, or, you know, just nationally, or maybe people I know And so I think there is ways. I don't have a formal way because there's limitations here within our system of who's available, but I think there's ways to help get folks connected outside of our sites if there's people that we know for sure. I'm aware that we're out of time, and what I'd like to do is wrap up, and thank you so much. We are very grateful for your time, Dr. Sanchez, all of your wisdom and your experience sharing that with us. We had a number of people here today, lots of questions and gratitude for your presentation, and here they come as we wrap up. And thank you for making your slides available. We will be posting the slides and the recording online. And then if you did register, please look for the evaluation coming to you by email so you can get your CEs. So with that, we will conclude today. And again, very grateful to you. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you.
As a reminder, we don't have any webinars in November and December on the 4th Fridays. We will resume programming in January. We will continue to have the community calls on the 3rd Thursday of every month. So we look forward to seeing you all. Thank you for coming.